Hello and welcome back, consumers. I'm Altari, the Professional Gamer, and we did not get an Alpha 2 date yet, but that leaves only 2 more weeks left until the end of the first quarter 2024, which we know we will get more information in the next 2 weeks. That is very exciting, but on a not as exciting but equally interesting note, we got a bunch of new screenshots from one of the updated dungeons in Alpha 2. I believe it's called the Rivulets, just based on some of the super secret sleuthing that I was able to do, or just looking at the file names. But either way, they look really, really cool. We're going to go through all of those screenshots and a little bit more in today's episode of the Pax Friday Review, the show where we talk about all of the fun, interesting, new, and exciting information that has dropped for Pax Day over the last week. If you haven't done so already, be sure to like this video as well as subscribe so that you can get notified whenever we post any new Pax Day related videos, and share with any of your friends who might also be interested in Pax Day. Let's go ahead and get into some screenshots. All right, so this week we have 12 new screenshots all around one of the newly updated Alpha 2 dungeons, and we're going to go over those. But really quickly, if you're interested in any of the lore that has to do with some of these dungeons, I highly recommend checking out our previous Pax Friday review, episode 44, where we talk about some of the big bads that are going to be located inside of some of these dungeons, which we will most likely have to scour for rare resources, among other things. So in these 12 screenshots, there are a lot of very cool looking visuals. So we're going to just go and take a look through them and see if we can find anything new here. So the first couple of screenshots that we had were from what is the deep cave entrances to some of these dungeons. And there are actually cave entrances to a lot of the dungeons that were in Alpha 1, and we found a couple of them while we were out exploring ourselves, and they led to kind of back entryways into a dungeon. Normally, you would have kind of a V that would be next to a set of ruins, and that's what would tell you that there's probably a pathway down into a dungeon. But then there were also a lot of other places where there were just these random caves that didn't even show up as an icon on the map, but if you went down to the bottom of them, you would find an entry into a dungeon as well, and it would put you into the same dungeon that if you went in the entrance from. So these look like they are the entryways for these kind of secret entrances into the dungeons, and they seem to be a lot more updated to make sense with where you're going. Before, in Alpha 1, you would just walk into these and there'd be a lot of rocks, maybe some vines, and maybe some scattered like carts or broken down pieces of equipment or something like that. But in this, I mean, we just have a whole heck of a lot of these weird kind of insect-like hives, and I think the screenshots here are even called hive. And that would make sense because there's a bunch of insects hanging out and around them. I would be really interested to see if there are ever going to be like new enemy types that come from these, like they spawn out of them and you're going to have to fight them. Because as it stands right now, in Alpha 1, when you would go through these caves, there weren't really any enemies at the bottom of them. They would just lead you directly into a dungeon, and then that's where all the enemies would be. So it would be cool to see these back cave entrances more guarded, and definitely incentivize players to consider whether or not they should go through the main entrance or the back entrance to something. Because as it stands right now, if you wanted to go through the front entrance in Alpha 1, then you would have to fight a whole heck of a lot more enemies than if you were to just run in the back end of a dungeon where there's no enemies. So hopefully they add some enemies at some point in the future, but really cool to see that they're adding a lot more flavor. And here is another just picture of those back caves, and you can kind of see down here, this is where it goes into what looks to be kind of more of the start of a dungeon, or maybe this is actually inside of a dungeon in and of itself, and this is just a cave section in that dungeon. But pretty cool to see that there are those kind of entryway points there as well. One thing I would really like to see in dungeon gameplay is to see if they could do the same thing that they do with the server transitions when you go from region to region, how it kind of seamlessly transitions and you're able to just walk through. It'd be really cool to see if maybe they could get their server loading to do something like that, but for dungeons, so you don't really ever feel like you're getting pulled into a loading screen and then jarringly put out back into the world in a completely new space. Now we actually make our way into a dungeon. Now, the file names for all of these said rivulets on it. There was a dungeon in Alpha 1 called the Rivulets, so I think this might be an updated version of that dungeon. And if it was the actual rivulets from the first alpha, I don't think I'd really recognize it at this point because there seems to be a heck of a lot more gore added to this front section. It is either gore or maybe wine or something like that. Maybe there's a lot of what looks to be food on the ground, but a really cool atmospheric shot here. And this was an image that I had actually called back to in last week's Pax FriDEI review. How there's these like carrion figures right here. Now, I don't really know what these are, as we haven't actually seen them in game. And I kind of think that they might have something to do with the Dukes. I almost feel like these more worm type things are either just a really good tribute to Dune, or they might have more of a kind of deity-like behavior to them, since they do appear a lot more in a lot of these dungeon imageries and motifs. Then here we have just another image, and it is really cool to see. I like how there's this mason work where all of the Zebians, it looks like, or people are trying to crawl their way out and they're kind of caught in the stone. It is a really cool, it almost makes me feel like these are actually bodies that have been molded against the wall and not just some person came in and etched them all out. But again, we can see some hives here, and then it looks like there might be either a hive or there was something that was underneath this. At some point, I wonder if we'll be able to kind of purify these areas and clean them of the gunk that is everywhere, and maybe that'll unlock some lore in the future. Then this is another picture of that same room, but now looking down. And we can also see this same imagery kind of carried on in a emblem further down. So it'll be really interesting when we do get into Alpha 2 to be able to go and explore some of these dungeons and see what we can actually find out in terms of the lore and what these things actually mean and why they're here. But in terms of atmosphere, these look great. And then here looks to be almost like it's an entrance, and maybe the entryway is in the back here and we're looking out from it. But I really like how these dials kind of look at the very front, and the symbols make me feel like there's going to be something to interpret here at some point. It just really screams like there should be something interesting here, and it's just not actually a component of the game yet. But I really do hope that they add kind of these interactable features in dungeons. Maybe this changes how the dungeon path kind of maps out, or you move it around and a wall opens somewhere else. But either way, it looks really, really cool to have kind of these draped little pieces here, plus all of the lighting. This is way better than what it looked like in Alpha 1. And if this is just an Alpha 2 kind of update for dungeons, that's really exciting to see where the dungeons will get to at way later stages in the game. And then here, looks like we just have another image of the same room or a very similar room. And I do just really like how they've filled it with so much more activity. Even though you don't see any of the mobs in this space, you can still see that there's a lot of just things to look at. You have the smoke, you have the different lighting that is picking up on all these different surfaces everywhere. And it just makes the entire space look and feel really alive and something that would actually exist. And it kind of adds a lot to the immersion too. Then here we have another kind of small passageway. And I really do like these kind of iron gates that they've made here as well. And then all the way down here at the very end, here is a good picture of what I was talking about last week. It said in the lore post that they would take humans, and if they were weaker and they couldn't become true Zebians, I guess, they would put them into these caskets and then breed them into insects, or they'd turn them into insects or something like that. And this is a good example of one. I tried to find it when I was editing last week and I couldn't find a good one. This is a really good example of what I was talking about, and this is something that exists in game already. So it kind of gives a very mummy-esque vibe, but yeah, that's where insects come out of. It's kind of gross. And here's another picture of that as well. You can see the little hole, and it almost looks like bugs are kind of coming out of it as well. But this is what I would say is definitely a kind of breeding ground for these insects, and lore-wise at least, this dungeon probably has a lot to do with kind of infecting people or things and corrupting them into the Zebian form or some kind of infested or really gross buggy form. And it looks like this is just another passageway, but then we have this really big emblem, and it looks like it mirrors a similar emblem to what we saw at the entrance, or what I would presume is the entrance of the Rivulets dungeon. But the symbol kind of carries throughout, and it has to have some kind of meaning. If I recall correctly from Alpha 1, when we were exploring a lot, these dungeons actually have symbols that look very similar, but they're actually pretty different from one another. So that'll probably have some form of significance in the future, and it'll definitely be worth our while to kind of catalog them going forward. Then this looks like a place where we are carrying some leather, but from what type of animal or person, I don't know. But either way, this looks quite gross, and not like a place you'd want to set up camp for altogether too long. But I wonder if these are going to have like cloth interaction physics at some point or something like that. But it would be really, really cool either way, and definitely looking forward to exploring some of this in the future. But those are all of the 12 screenshots that we had to go through this week. I know it's not what we were all hoping for. We were really hoping that we would get a Alpha 2 date, and I think it's safe to say at this point in the next week or 2 weeks, we're going to be getting a whole heck of a lot of information. We're probably going to get an Alpha 2 date at some point in the next 14 days. It's bound to happen, y'all. It's going to happen in the next 14 days. So I'm looking forward to all of that. We're going to, of course, cover all of that whenever it happens. So be sure you subscribe to this channel so that you can get notified whenever we post any new videos, so that you can stay up to date. As always, it really helps spread our YouTube videos out to the general public and helps with all that algorithm stuff. And then share with any of your friends who might be interested in Pax Dei. A lot of screenshots to go over right now, but I feel like in the coming weeks, once we get access into Alpha 2, there's going to be a lot more gameplay and other things to talk about. So be sure to stay tuned and keep a lookout for the channel in the next coming weeks. So until next time, I'm Altari the Professional Gamer. Have a good rest of your week.